Good evening, traveller. Or perhaps I should say good night, for the hour grows late, and the moonlight has already begun to peek through my window. My name is not particularly important. Not tonight, at least. What matters is that you found your way here, to this quiet corner of the city, where the gaslight flickers with a warmth that never quite reaches the pavement, where the rain taps its gentle rhythm against window panes that have witnessed more stories than any book could hold, and where mysteries unfold not with violence or urgency, but with the soft inevitability of autumn leaves drifting to rest. This is a place that exists somewhere between waking and dreaming, between the rational world of deduction and the older world of myth and wonder. The streets here are perpetually wrapped in mist, not the threatening kind that conceals danger, but the comforting kind that muffles the harsh edges of reality and turns even the most ordinary lamppost into something worthy of contemplation. I keep an office here, though office seems too formal a word for what is really just a room with a desk, a fire that never quite goes out, and enough books to build walls against the outside world. The leather of my chair has grown soft with years of use. The tea in my cup is always precisely the right temperature, and the rain outside never stops. But then, why would you want it to? You're welcome to settle in. There's another chair by the fire if you'd like it. The cushions are deep. The light is low. And I've found over the years that the best way to approach a mystery is not with frantic energy, but with patient curiosity. We're not here to solve crimes that demand justice or right terrible wrongs. We're here simply to observe, to consider, to let our minds wander down paths both logical and fantastical until they find their natural resting place. Tonight, I have 3 cases to share with you. 3 mysteries that have crossed my desk in recent weeks. Each one different in character. Each one offering its own particular variety of quiet wonder. The first is a matter of careful observation and gentle deduction. The kind of puzzle that Sherlock Holmes himself might have appreciated, though he would certainly have solved it faster and with considerably less kindness than I intend to employ. The second draws from the deeper well of human mythology, examining an ancient tale through the lens of detective work, asking not whether the myth is true, but what truth might live within the myth. And the third is the sort of mystery that doesn't particularly want to be solved. It prefers to remain suspended in possibility, like fog itself. Present, real, but never quite solid enough to grasp. You needn't worry about remembering all the details. You needn't worry about anything at all, really. Just listen or drift or dream. The fire will keep burning, the rain will keep falling, and the fog will remain exactly where it belongs. Everywhere, nowhere, and always. Let us begin. Mystery 1. The rational case. The vanishing lighthouse keeper. The case came to me on a Tuesday. Though in this city it's often difficult to tell one day from another. They all carry the same quality of soft grey light, the same sound of distant foghorns calling to ships that may or may not exist. A woman arrived at my door just as the afternoon was settling into evening, that particular hour when the lamplighters begin their rounds and the city transforms from one version of itself into another. She was perhaps 60 years of age, with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun, and eyes that had clearly spent decades looking at horizons. Her name was Margaret Whitmore, and she had travelled 3 days by train and coach to reach my door, though the place she'd come from was not particularly distant in miles. It was distant in other ways. Remote. The sort of location that exists at the edge of maps, where the land meets the sea, and both seem uncertain about the arrangement. I'm told you investigate unusual matters, she said, her voice carrying the slight rasp of someone who'd spent years speaking over wind and waves. Matters that the police might find too peculiar for their reports. I invited her to sit, poured her tea, waited. My brother has disappeared, she said, wrapping both hands around the cup as if drawing warmth from it. Thomas Whitmore. He's the keeper of Whitmore Point Lighthouse. Has been for 32 years. Our father had the post before him, and our grandfather before that. It's been in the family for nearly a century. She paused, looking into her tea as if it might contain answers. Thomas would never abandon his post, she continued. Never. The lighthouse is his life, his purpose, his entire world. But 4 days ago, the light went dark. The harbour master sent a man to check, and they found the lighthouse empty. Completely empty. Thomas was gone. His belongings were gone. Even his logbook was missing. It was as if he'd never been there at all. I made a note in my casebook. The scratch of pen on paper, joining the rain's rhythm. And yet you believe he didn't leave willingly, I said. I know he didn't, she replied with absolute certainty. Thomas wrote to me every Sunday without fail. His last letter arrived 6 days ago. It was ordinary. He mentioned the weather, a pod of whales he'd seen passing, his plans to repaint the gallery rail come spring. There wasn't a hint of intention to leave, no suggestion of distress or dissatisfaction. What do the authorities say? Margaret's expression tightened. That he's a grown man, free to go where he pleases. That lighthouse keeping is a lonely profession, and it's not uncommon for keepers to simply walk away one day. They've made note of his disappearance, but they're not investigating. They say there's nothing to investigate. But you disagree. I know my brother, she said simply, and I know something is wrong. I agreed to take the case, though not because I sensed anything sinister. The truth is, I was drawn by the image she'd painted. A lighthouse standing empty, its light gone dark, the sea continuing its eternal rhythm against rocks that had seen generations of Whitmores come and go. It felt like the beginning of a story, and I've always been partial to beginnings. We left the following morning. The journey took us north and east, away from the comfortable fog of the city, and into a landscape of increasingly bare hills and wind-twisted trees. Margaret was a quiet travelling companion, spending most of the train ride looking out the window at the passing countryside, her fingers occasionally moving as if writing letters in the air, a habit, I imagined, developed over years of correspondence with her brother. The train deposited us at a small coastal village called Saltmere, a collection of grey-stone buildings that seemed to huddle together against the wind. The smell of the sea was immediate and pervasive, salt and seaweed, and the particular kind of dampness that comes from air that's never entirely dry. We took a room at the only inn, an establishment run by a woman named Mrs. Talbot, who had the weathered face of someone who'd spent a lifetime squinting into ocean spray. She remembered Margaret from childhood visits and expressed appropriate concern about Thomas's disappearance, though I noticed her concern carried a certain resignation, as if disappearances were simply part of the natural order of things in a place like this. The lighthouse is a 2-mile walk along the coastal path, Mrs. Talbot said, pouring us tea that was almost black and strong enough to strip paint, though I'd not recommend going after dark. The path can be treacherous, and with the light gone out, there's nothing to guide you back. We assured her we'd wait for morning, though I confess I stood at my window for some time that night, looking north toward where I knew the lighthouse must stand, seeing only darkness where there should have been a sweeping beam. It felt wrong, that absence of light, like a heartbeat that had stopped. Morning came with its usual grey softness, and Margaret and I set out along the coastal path. It was indeed treacherous in places. Narrow sections where the cliff dropped away to rocks and churning water far below. Spots where the path had partially crumbled and required careful navigation. But it was also beautiful in that stark, uncompromising way that coastal landscapes often are. Seabirds wheeled overhead, their cries sharp against the sound of waves. Wildflowers clung to impossible patches of soil. The wind carried stories from 1,000 miles away. And then, rounding a final curve, we saw it. Whitmore Point Lighthouse stood on a promontory of dark rock that jutted into the sea like an accusing finger. It was painted white with a single red band around its midsection. Though the paint was weathered and peeling in places, the keeper's cottage sat adjacent to the tower. A squat stone building with small windows and a roof of slate tiles. Both structures looked solidly built, designed to withstand whatever the ocean might throw at them. But there was something profoundly lonely about the scene. Perhaps it was the stillness. No smoke from the cottage chimney, no movement in the windows, no sign that anyone had been there in days. Or perhaps it was simply the knowledge that a light which had burned faithfully for nearly a century had gone dark, and with it had gone a man who dedicated his life to keeping it lit.
The door to the cottage was unlocked. We entered.
The interior was exactly as one might expect of a lighthouse keeper's dwelling. Practical, spare, everything in its place. A small kitchen with neatly arranged pots and pans. A sitting room with a single armchair positioned by the window. A stack of well-read books on the side table. A bedroom with a narrow bed precisely made, the blanket tucked with military precision. And yet, as Margaret had said, it felt empty, not just of people but of presence. There were no personal photographs on the walls, no letters or papers visible, none of the small accumulations of daily life that mark a space as inhabited. "This isn't right," Margaret said, moving slowly through the rooms. Thomas had photographs. Our parents, our grandparents, pictures of ships he'd guided safely to harbour. He kept his logbooks going back decades. He was proud of them, studied them like history texts. And his pipe collection. He must have had 20 pipes, all displayed on a rack he'd made himself. Where is everything? We searched more carefully then, looking not just for Thomas, but for the traces of his life. We found nothing. The drawers were empty, the closets bare. Even the kitchen cupboards contained only the most basic supplies. Tea, flour, tinned goods, arranged with a sterility that suggested they'd never been used. It's as if the place has been staged, I murmured, running my finger along a shelf that should have been dusty, but wasn't. Made to look like someone could live here, but stripped of any evidence that someone actually did. We climbed the tower next. The spiral staircase was iron, our footsteps echoing in the enclosed space as we ascended. Round and round, up and up, past the oil storage level, past the watchroom, until finally we emerged into the lantern room itself. This, at least, showed signs of regular use. The Fresnel lens was clean and carefully maintained, its prismatic glass catching what little light filtered through the windows and scattering it in subtle rainbows across the curved walls. The logbook stand was there, though the logbook itself was gone. Tools were neatly arranged. Wrenches, cleaning cloths, spare wicks. Everything a keeper would need to maintain the light. But the lamp was cold, dark, silent. I walked slowly around the gallery, examining everything with careful attention. It was Margaret who noticed it first. "The lock," she said, pointing to the door that led out to the exterior gallery. "It's been forced." She was right. The lock mechanism was intact, but showed clear signs of having been jimmied open from the outside. Scratches in the metal, a slight bend in the striker plate. Someone had broken into the lighthouse from the gallery, which made no sense at all. The gallery was accessible only from inside the tower, or by climbing the exterior wall, which would have been nearly impossible given the smooth surface and the height. Unless, of course, someone had used a ladder. But where would they have taken it afterward? And why break in when the cottage door below was unlocked? I stepped out onto the gallery, gripping the railing firmly. The wind was stronger up here, pulling at my coat and hair. Far below, the sea threw itself against the rocks with patient violence. I looked down at those rocks, then up at the sky, then back at the lock. "May I see your brother's last letter?" I asked Margaret. She produced it from her bag. A single sheet of paper covered in neat, careful handwriting. I read it through once, then again, paying attention not to what was said, but to what wasn't. The weather had been fine. The whales had passed heading south. The gallery rail needed painting. He was reading a book about Arctic exploration. He'd had stew for dinner 3 nights running because he'd made too much and hated to waste. Ordinary details, the comfortable minutiae of a solitary life. But something nagged at me. I read it a 3rd time. "The whales," I said. "Heading south." "Yes," Margaret replied. "Thomas always noted the whales when they passed. He loved them." "Whales migrate south in autumn," I said slowly, moving toward warmer waters for winter. "But it's spring. They should be heading north." Margaret frowned. Perhaps he was mistaken. Even Thomas could err. "Perhaps," I agreed. But I didn't think so. I borrowed the letter, and we descended the tower, walking back through the cottage with fresh eyes. This time, I paid attention to the details that were present, rather than those that were absent. The book on the side table was a popular novel published 2 months prior. The tea in the kitchen was a brand that hadn't existed when Margaret and Thomas were children. The blanket on the bed was made from modern synthetic fabric, not the wool you'd expect in a lighthouse that had been in the same family for generations. "Margaret," I said carefully, "when did you last visit your brother here?" She thought for a moment. "It must be, goodness, 12 years ago. Perhaps more. Thomas preferred to visit me in the city when he took his leave. He said once you'd been away from the lighthouse. The silence of it felt even deeper when you returned." I nodded, pieces beginning to align in my mind like the facets of the Fresnel lens upstairs. "I believe," I said, "that we need to visit the harbour master." The harbour master's office was a cluttered space smelling of tobacco and old rope, presided over by a man named Davies, who had the rolling gait of someone more comfortable on a deck than on solid ground. He greeted Margaret with sympathy and me with the polite wariness people often show toward investigators. "Terrible business about Thomas," he said, settling behind a desk piled high with charts and ledgers. Fine keeper he was, reliable as the tide. Never missed a night in 32 years. "Tell me," I said, "when did the lighthouse service last conduct an official inspection?" Davies pulled out a ledger, licked his thumb, paged through. "Let's see. Would have been 6 months back. November. All in order, as usual." "And the inspector who conducted that examination, might we speak with him?" "Afraid not. Old Jenkins retired right after that inspection. Moved to Cornwall to live with his daughter. But I can show you the report if you like." He produced a file, and I read through the inspection notes carefully. Everything had been found satisfactory. The lens was properly maintained. The fuel stores were adequate. The keeper's dwelling was clean and well kept. The keeper himself, Thomas Whitmore, had been in good health and spirits, showing no signs of distress or intention to abandon his post. The report was signed and dated. It all seemed perfectly in order, except this signature, I said, pointing to the inspector's mark. You're certain this is Jenkins's hand? Davies squinted at it. Well, I assume so. Though now you mention it, it does look a bit shaky. But Jenkins was getting on in years. Hands weren't as steady as they used to be.
Might you have an example of his signature from an earlier report? For comparison.
Davies rummaged and produced another inspection from 2 years prior. The signatures were markedly different. The earlier one firm and confident, the recent one tremulous and uncertain, as if written by someone unfamiliar with the name they were signing. Mr. Davies, I said, I need you to think very carefully. When was the last time you personally saw Thomas Whitmore? Not received a report about him? Not heard that everything was fine? When did you last see him with your own eyes? The harbour master's face went through several expressions as he thought back through months and years. Finally, with growing uncertainty, he said, I suppose it must be. I'm not actually certain. He kept to himself. Did Thomas? Had his supplies delivered? Sent reports by post? I assumed. He trailed off, the implications dawning on him. You assumed everything was fine because there was no reason to assume otherwise. I finished gently. And why would there be? The light was lit every night. Reports arrived regularly. The lighthouse performed its function. There was no cause for concern. But if it wasn't Thomas sending those reports, Margaret said, her voice tight, who was it? That was indeed the question. I asked Davies for the records of supply deliveries to the lighthouse. Who made them? When? What was included? He produced them readily enough, showing a pattern of monthly deliveries made by a local merchant named Carmichael. We found Carmichael at his shop, a narrow establishment selling everything from fishing tackle to tinned peaches. He was a thin man with nervous hands that were never quite still. And when I asked about his deliveries to the lighthouse, those hands became more agitated still. Just left the supplies at the cottage door like always, he said, not meeting my eyes. Thomas was particular about his privacy. didn't like to be disturbed during the day, said it interrupted his sleep schedule, him being up all night with the light and all. So you never actually saw him? I said. Well, no, but the money was always left out for me. Same spot, every time, never short a penny. And the shopping lists. How did you know what to bring? Same as always. Standard order, never varied. Tea, flour, tinned goods, lamp oil. Thomas was a creature of habit. Did you find that odd? I asked. That in 32 years, his needs never changed. That he never requested anything unusual, never asked for a particular book or a favorite food. Carmichael shifted uncomfortably. I suppose I never thought about it much. Lighthouse keepers are solitary folk, don't have the same wants as regular people. We thanked him and left. Walking back along the harbour front as fishing boats rocked gently in their moorings and gulls fought over scraps. Someone has been impersonating Thomas, Margaret said. For how long? That, I replied, is what we need to determine. I spent the evening in my room at the inn, going through everything we'd learned, arranging it in my mind like evidence on a table. The forced lock on the gallery door, the whales migrating in the wrong direction, the modern items in an old keeper's cottage, the forged inspection signature, the delivery man who'd never seen his customer, and slowly, piece by piece, a picture emerged. The next morning, I asked Mrs. Talbot about the local medical practice. She directed me to a Dr. Ashford who kept an office above the chemist's shop. He was an elderly gentleman with kind eyes and hands marked by decades of healing work. I'm investigating the disappearance of Thomas Whitmore, I told him. I understand doctor-patient confidentiality is sacred, but any information you could provide might help us understand what happened to him. Dr. Ashford was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, Thomas Whitmore hasn't been my patient for nearly 15 years. Not since his sister, Margaret, I believe, moved away to the city. After that, he became rather reclusive, refused house calls, said he was fit as a fiddle and didn't need medical attention. 15 years, I repeated. You're certain? Quite certain. I remember because it was around the same time we had that terrible storm, the one that damaged the lighthouse gallery. Thomas supervised the repairs himself, wouldn't let anyone else up the tower. Said he knew every stone of that lighthouse, like he knew his own bones. That was the last time I spoke with him properly. The storm that damaged the gallery. The repairs that Thomas supervised personally, letting no one else into the tower. I felt the final piece slide into place. I gathered Margaret and Davies and returned to the lighthouse one more time. We climbed the tower again, but this time I paid careful attention to the walls themselves, running my hands over the stone, looking for any irregularity. On the western side, opposite the door, I found it. A section of wall where the mortar was newer. The stones not quite aligned with the same precision as the rest. It was subtle, easily missed if you weren't looking for it, but it was there. During the storm repairs, I said, Thomas rebuilt part of this wall himself, and I believe that somewhere behind these stones we'll find what happened to him. It took effort and tools borrowed from the village, but eventually we managed to remove several of the stones. Behind them, in a cavity carefully constructed within the tower wall itself, we found a metal box. Inside the box, Thomas Whitmore's logbooks, going back 30 years. His personal effects, photographs, letters, his pipe collection, and a final entry in his own hand, dated 15 years ago. I read it aloud to Margaret in the fading afternoon light. The pain has become unbearable. Dr. Ashford says there's nothing more to be done. 6 months, perhaps less. I can't bear the thought of this lighthouse going dark, even for the time it would take to train a new keeper. Our family has kept this light burning for 97 years. It must reach 100. It must. I've made arrangements. A man from the service. He's agreed to take my place, to live my life, to keep the light burning. He's young, capable, reliable. He'll wear my name like a coat and no one will know the difference. The lighthouse will continue. The light will shine. That's all that matters. I'll seal this record in the wall, along with proof of who I was. Perhaps someday someone will find it. Perhaps not. But the light will burn. The light will always burn. This is my last watch. I'm going to walk down to the rocks below, to the place where my father's ashes were scattered, and his father's before that. I'll watch the sun set one final time, and then I'll go into the water, and the sea will take me home. Keep the light burning. Thomas Whitmore. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Margaret's quiet tears and the eternal rhythm of the waves below. He arranged his own replacement, she said finally. Found someone to live his life so the lighthouse wouldn't go dark. And that replacement has kept his promise for 15 years, I added. maintaining the light, sending reports, living in complete isolation, all to honor a dying man's final wish. Until recently. What happened recently? Davies asked. The lighthouse service decided to automate, I said. I saw the notices in the harbour master's office. This lighthouse is scheduled for automation next year. No more need for a keeper. The man who'd been living as Thomas Whitmore would be out of a job. His purpose gone. And he couldn't simply leave and explain the situation without revealing the deception he'd maintained for 15 years. So he chose instead to vanish, to remove all evidence of his presence, to erase both himself and the man he'd been pretending to be. But the forced lock, Margaret said, the gallery door. I believe he staged that to make it look as though something mysterious had occurred. A final performance in service to the myth of Thomas Whitmore. Not a mundane retirement, but a disappearance worthy of the lighthouse keeper who'd kept the light burning for 32 years. We stood together in the lantern room as the sun began to set, painting the sea in shades of copper and gold. And I realized that while I'd solved the mystery of Thomas Whitmore's disappearance, I'd done so by unraveling a larger mystery, a 15-year act of devotion, a promise kept in absolute isolation, a light that had continued burning because two men, separated by death but united in purpose, had willed it so. What will you tell the authorities? Davies asked. I looked at Margaret. She was gazing out at the sea, her expression distant. We'll tell them that Thomas Whitmore died 15 years ago of natural causes, I said. That he made arrangements for the lighthouse to continue operating until automation could be implemented. That his final wishes were honored by a dedicated serviceman who is now retired. There's no crime here, no mystery that demands investigation, just a story of devotion to duty. Margaret nodded slowly. And the replacement keeper? The man who lived as my brother. What about him? Gone, I said. Vanished into whatever life he had before he took on the name Thomas Whitmore. Perhaps he's found peace. I hope he has. He earned it. We descended the tower one final time. As we walked back along the coastal path in the gathering dusk, I looked back once and saw that the lighthouse beam had come on. Automated now, controlled by a timer, requiring no human hand to keep it burning. But in my mind, I saw Thomas Whitmore on his final night, walking down to the rocks below, watching the sun set over the water he'd guarded for 30 years. And I saw the young man who'd taken his place, climbing that spiral stair night after night for 15 years, keeping a promise to a dead man, maintaining a light that guided ships safely home. The mystery was solved. The light still burned, and somewhere in the vast indifference of the sea, two men who'd never met had achieved a kind of immortality together. One through dying with purpose, the other through living with devotion. That seemed to me a good ending. Not a happy one, perhaps, but a true one. And sometimes that's all a mystery can offer. Mystery 2. The mythic case. The ferryman's coin. The fire has burned down to embers now, but there's still warmth enough. Are you comfortable? Good. Then let me tell you about the second case. One that required me to investigate not a person, but a story. A myth examined through a detective's lens, seeking not proof of its literal truth, but understanding of the truth it contains. It began, as many of my cases do, with a visitor. His name was Professor Edmund Whitby, and he arrived on a Wednesday evening, carrying a leather satchel that looked older than he was. He was perhaps 70, with the sort of face that suggested he'd spent his life thinking deeply about difficult questions and hadn't found satisfactory answers to most of them. I'm an anthropologist, he explained, settling into the chair across from my desk. I've spent 40 years studying death customs across cultures. Funeral rites, burial practices, the various ways humanity has dealt with mortality. And I've recently made a discovery that troubles me. He opened the satchel and removed a notebook filled with sketches and annotations. In every culture I've studied, he continued, there exists some version of the same practice. The dead are buried or burned with coins, placed in their mouths, on their eyes, in their hands. The specific placement varies, but the coin itself is universal. From ancient Greece to medieval Europe, to indigenous peoples in the Americas and Asia. Everywhere, the same symbolic gesture. The coin for the dead. Charon's obol, I said. Payment for the ferryman to carry souls across the river Styx. Yes, that's the Greek version. But Professor Whitby leaned forward intently. It predates Greece by millennia, and it persists long after anyone believed in Charon or the Styx. Why? Why does this single image, the coin, the ferryman, the river that must be crossed, appear independently in cultures separated by oceans and centuries? You're asking me to investigate a myth, I asked. I'm asking you to help me understand why the myth won't die, he replied. I've found references to ferryman figures in cultures that had no contact with each other, no way of sharing stories. The Egyptian bark that carries Ra through the underworld, the Japanese Sanzu River with its crossing fee, the Mayan journey through Xibalba, the Celtic tales of boats to the other world. Always a crossing, always a payment, always a ferryman who must be satisfied. He pulled out a map, spreading it across my desk. It was marked with dozens of red dots, each one representing a culture with ferryman mythology. I've plotted every instance I could find, he said. And look, they cluster around waterways, major rivers, coastlines, places where ancient peoples would have been intimately familiar with the act of crossing water. But that alone doesn't explain the universality. Plenty of water-faring cultures developed no such myth. So, why these places? Why this story? I studied the map, intrigued despite myself. The red dots did indeed cluster around water, but there was no clear pattern to their distribution, no single origin point from which the myth might have spread. What do you want from me, Professor? I asked. I want you to investigate the myth as if it were a case, he said. Apply your methods of deduction and observation. Help me understand not whether Charon existed, but why he persists in human imagination. What truth is the myth protecting? What human need does it serve? It was an unusual request, but then, I've always been drawn to unusual requests. I agreed to consider the matter, and Professor Whitby left me his notebooks and maps, along with a small wooden box. One more thing, he said as he departed. I found this in an archaeological dig in Greece. It was buried with a young woman who died nearly 3,000 years ago. Inside the box was a coin, bronze, worn almost smooth by time, but still bearing faint traces of a design. A boat, a figure with an oar, and what might have been waves, or might have been the suggestion of another shore. I kept the coin on my desk as I began my investigation, its weight surprisingly substantial for something so small. It became a focus for thought, an anchor for contemplation as I dove into Professor Whitby's research. The first thing I did was what I always do. I looked for patterns. The ferryman myth, in all its variations, contains certain consistent elements. a boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead, a crossing that must be made, a figure who facilitates that crossing, and most importantly, a payment required. But the nature of that payment varied. Sometimes it was coin, yes, but in other traditions it was food, or flowers, or objects the deceased had valued in life. The payment was symbolic, not economic. It represented something being given up, something being left behind. I made notes, drawing connections between different versions of the myth. In Greek tradition, souls who could not pay carum wandered the shores of the Styx for 100 years before being allowed to cross. The emphasis was on waiting, on delay, on the journey taking longer than it should. In Japanese tradition, the crossing of the Sanzu River was determined by the weight of one's sins. The guilty had to ford through deep, rapid waters, while the innocent crossed easily via bridge. The emphasis was on judgment, on the crossing itself being difficult or easy based on how one had lived. In Celtic tradition, the boat to the other world left only at certain times, from certain places, and could only be boarded by those who knew the proper words or carried the proper tokens. The emphasis was on knowledge, on having the right information to make the journey. Different cultures, different emphases, but all circling around the same core concept. Death is a journey, and journeys require preparation. I spent several evenings reading through Professor Whitby's field notes, accounts of actual burial practices observed in various cultures. What struck me was the care taken, the deliberation. Even in societies with minimal material wealth, resources were devoted to ensuring the dead were properly prepared for their journey. Coins that could have bought food for the living were instead placed with corpses. Precious objects were buried rather than kept. Why? The economic irrationality of it suggested the practice served a purpose beyond the practical. It was ritual, yes, but ritual in service of something. What? I decided to approach the question from a different angle. Instead of asking why the myth existed, I asked, what would be lost if it didn't exist? Imagine a culture with no myth of crossing, no ferryman, no ritual preparation of the dead. What would that look like? It would mean death was simply ending. A door that closed with no other side. The living would have no way to conceptualize what happened to the deceased. No framework for understanding where they had gone. More importantly, they would have no actions to take, no rituals to perform, no way of helping the dead on their journey, because there would be no journey to help with. The myth, I realized, wasn't about the dead at all. Not really. It was about the living. It gave the bereaved something to do, a way to participate in the death of their loved ones. By placing a coin with the body, by making sure the deceased was prepared for crossing, the living maintained a connection. They weren't helpless in the face of death. They could still provide, still protect, still care for those who had departed. The ferryman wasn't a supernatural being demanding payment. He was a metaphor for the work of grief itself. Crossing the river meant accepting death, letting go, allowing the deceased to move beyond reach, and that crossing required payment. Not money, but the emotional work of mourning, the gradual release of the connection to the person who had died. I wrote this theory in my notebook, but I wasn't satisfied. It explained the persistence of the myth, but it didn't explain its universality. Why this specific image of a ferryman and a coin? Why not a different metaphor entirely? That's when I remembered something Professor Whitby had mentioned. The clusters around waterways. I pulled out the map again, studying it more carefully. The red dots marked cultures with ferryman myths, but when I overlaid a map of ancient trade routes, something interesting emerged. Many of these cultures weren't just near water. They were at crossroads, places where rivers met, where sea lanes intersected, where different peoples and their ideas came together. And ferries, actual, physical ferries operated by real ferrymen demanding real payment, would have been common in these locations, part of daily life, something everyone understood, everyone had experienced. The myth, then, might have emerged from lived experience. People knew what it was like to stand on a riverbank, unable to cross until they could pay the ferryman. They knew the vulnerability of being in a boat, suspended between shores, dependent on someone else's skill to reach the other side. They knew that some crossings were easy and some were dangerous, that some ferrymen were honest and some charged too much, that you needed the right coin or you'd be left waiting. All of this was familiar, concrete, real. And when people tried to imagine what death might be like, that ultimate journey into unknown territory, they reached for a metaphor they understood. The ferryman became the guardian of death, not because he was invented to fill that role, but because ferrymen already existed as figures of transition, guides who helped people cross from one place to another for a price. The myth was an analogy made literal, a practical experience elevated to spiritual significance. But there was still something missing from my understanding. The coin itself. Why specifically a coin? I picked up the ancient Greek coin from its box, feeling its weight in my palm. Bronze mostly, worth very little even when it was new. So why bury it with the dead instead of keeping it for the living? Unless I thought about the nature of coins. They're not valuable in themselves. Bronze has some utility, but a coin's worth comes from what it represents. It's a token of exchange, a promise that someone somewhere will accept it as payment for goods or services. A coin is pure symbolic value, and symbols can cross boundaries that physical objects cannot. The living and the dead exist in different economies. Food, clothing, shelter, the things that matter to the living are meaningless to the dead. But symbols can travel between worlds. A coin placed with the dead isn't payment in any practical sense. It's a message. It says, "You are not forgotten. You are not unprepared. You have what you need for the journey." It's the last gift the living can give. Not something the dead can use, but something that demonstrates the living still care, still provide, still maintain the bonds of relationship, even across the boundary of death. I wrote all of this in my report to Professor Whitby, feeling as though I'd solved a case without a crime, investigated a mystery without a culprit. But I'd found something nonetheless, not proof of Karen's existence, but proof of humanity's need for him. When I delivered my findings, Professor Whitby read through them carefully, his expression thoughtful. "So the myth persists," he said slowly, "because it serves a psychological function. It gives structure to grief, provides ritual actions that help the bereaved process loss, and maintains connection between the living and dead through symbolic exchange." Yes, I agreed, but also because it's based on real experience. Ferrymen were real. Crossings were real. The anxiety of transition, the need for payment, the dependence on a guide, all of that was part of daily life for countless generations. The myth didn't invent these concepts. It sacralized them, made them meaningful beyond their practical function. The professor was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a coin. Modern, ordinary, worth perhaps enough to buy a cup of tea. When I die, he said, I want this placed with me. I don't believe in Quran, you understand. I don't think there's a literal river or a literal ferryman. But I like the idea that someone will care enough to make sure I'm prepared, that I'll make that final journey with a gift from someone who loved me. That seems important, even if it's just symbolism. He put the coin back in his pocket, where it clinked against his keys and pocket watch. The ordinary objects of a living person's life. You've helped me understand why the myth won't die, he said. It's because we don't want it to. We need our metaphors for death. We need our rituals of transition. Without them, death is too vast, too absolute, too lonely. The ferryman makes it human-sized, comprehensible, even in a strange way, comforting. After he left, I sat for a long time holding that ancient Greek coin, thinking about the young woman buried with it 3,000 years ago. Someone had loved her enough to make sure she had what she needed for her journey. Someone had stood at her grave and placed that coin carefully, ritually, believing or hoping or simply needing to believe that it mattered. And here it was, 3 millennia later, still carrying meaning, still serving as evidence that love persists, that care continues, that we find ways to help each other even when one of us has gone somewhere the other cannot follow. The case was closed. The myth was understood. But the coin remained, as coins always do, waiting for another crossing, another journey, another chance to serve as proof that even in the face of death, we do not abandon each other. We pay the ferryman. We help each other across. We maintain the myths that make mortality bearable. And perhaps, in the end, that's the only immortality we can count on. Not that we ourselves will live forever, but that those who come after will remember, will care, will place coins with their dead, and tell stories about ferrymen. And in doing so, will keep alive the truth that the myth protects. We are not alone, not in life and not in death. There is always someone willing to help us cross. Mystery 3, the unsolved whisper, the clockmaker's daughter. The hour grows late now, and the rain has softened to a gentle whisper against the windows. The fire is nearly out, just glowing embers casting uncertain shadows. This seems the right atmosphere for the third case. the one that resists solution, that prefers mystery to revelation. Some cases don't want to be solved. They want to remain suspended in possibility, like a question you ask yourself late at night, but never quite answer because the wondering feels more true than any conclusion could be. This is one of those cases. It came to me not as a request, but as a rumor, carried on the kind of wind that blows through old cities and rustles the pages of forgotten books. Someone mentioned it at a bookshop. Someone else elaborated at a cafe. And gradually, piece by piece, the story assembled itself without my seeking it. There is a clock tower in the old quarter of the city. You've probably passed it a dozen times without really seeing it. That's the nature of familiar things. They become invisible through repetition. But if you were to stop and look up on a night like this, when the fog has settled and the gaslight makes everything seem suspended in amber, you might notice something unusual. The clock keeps perfect time, not approximately perfect, not close enough for practical purposes. Actually, genuinely, impossibly perfect time. It never gains a second, never loses one. It has maintained this precision for exactly 117 years, through all weather, through mechanical degradation that should have slowed it down or sped it up, through the natural entropy that affects all things. The clock was built by a man named Cornelius Thorne, who was, by all accounts, the finest horologist in the city. He could repair watches that other craftsmen had declared hopeless. He could build timepieces of such delicacy that they would run for decades without maintenance. He understood time, people said, in a way that went beyond mere mechanical knowledge. Cornelius had a daughter named Elise. This much is documented fact. Her birth is recorded in city registers. Her childhood is remembered, vaguely, by the few people old enough to have overlapping memories with her existence. She was real, but then the story becomes softer, less certain. According to the tale, Elise became ill when she was 17. The sickness came suddenly, a fever that wouldn't break, a weakness that deepened by the day. Cornelius tried everything. Doctors came and went. Medicines were administered. Prayers were offered. But the illness progressed with the inevitability of clockwork, each day taking her a measured degree closer to death, until one morning the fever broke. Elise woke clear-eyed and smiling, declared herself hungry, ate breakfast with her father, and seemed entirely recovered. But something was wrong. Cornelius noticed it first. Perhaps because he was attuned to subtle rhythms and patterns, Elise moved differently, not unhealthily, but precisely. Her gestures had a measured quality. Her footsteps fell at exact intervals. Even her breathing seemed to occur at perfectly regular intervals, never varying, never changing with emotion or exertion. She had become, in some fundamental way, clockwork, or so the story says. Cornelius, according to the tale, understood what had happened. His daughter was alive, yes, awake and moving and speaking, but she was also dying, her life running down like a wound spring, each moment perfectly measured, because there were only a measured number of moments left. So he did the only thing a clockmaker could do. He built her a clock. Not a clock to mark time, but a clock to hold it. A mechanism so perfect, so precisely calibrated, that it could contain what remained of his daughter's life and make it last forever, if possible, or at least far longer than the few days her illness-racked body would have given her. The clock tower was built in 7 months. Cornelius worked day and night, accepting no help, allowing no one to see the mechanisms taking shape in his workshop. When it was finished, he had it installed in the old quarter, its face visible from most of the city, its bells meant to ring on the hour. But the bells have never rung. Not once in 117 years. The clock keeps time silently, its hands sweeping around the face with absolute precision, marking seconds and minutes and hours without sound, without disturbance, without announcing itself to the city it serves. And Elise Thorne vanished. There's no death record, no marriage certificate that might explain a name change, no evidence she moved away or met with any misfortune. She was simply gone. Last seen the day before the clock tower was completed. Never seen again. The story says Cornelius built the clock to contain her life, and once it was complete, he placed her inside it. Not her body. That would be grotesque. And this is not that kind of tale. But her essence, her spark, whatever it is that makes the difference between being alive and being a collection of flesh that used to be alive. She's in the clock, the story says. Her life is the mechanism. Her heartbeat is the tick. Her remaining days, months, years, however long she had left, have been stretched out through perfect mechanical precision, each moment savoured, none wasted, lasting and lasting, because the clock never stops and the clock never errs. Cornelius himself died 20 years after completing the tower. He left no explanation, no confession, no documents describing how the clock was built or why it keeps such perfect time. His workshop was found empty of tools and plans, as if he'd removed all evidence of his work. The clock tower's mechanisms are hidden behind locked doors that have no keys. The city maintains the tower's exterior, replaces worn stonework, but no one has accessed the clockworks themselves in nearly a century. And still, the clock keeps perfect time. I became interested in this story, though interested perhaps understates it. Haunted might be more accurate. I found myself walking past the clock tower at odd hours, looking up at its face, watching the hands move with their impossible precision. I researched Cornelius Thorne, found records of his work, located several of his pieces in museums and private collections, examined them with jeweler's loupes and technical curiosity. They were masterworks, yes, extraordinarily well made, but not impossible, not magical, just very, very good. Good enough to keep perfect time for over a century. Perhaps, perhaps not. I searched for records of Elise, found her birth certificate, found school records from her childhood, found a sketch of her drawn by a street artist when she was 15. A girl with dark hair and thoughtful eyes, holding a small mechanical bird her father had made for her. But after the date, the story claims she became ill. There's nothing, no records at all, as if she simply stopped existing in any official capacity. I spoke with historians who specialized in the city's old quarter. They knew the story, of course. Some dismissed it as pure fiction, a romantic tale that had grown around an admittedly unusual clock tower. Others were less certain. They pointed out oddities, coincidences, details that didn't quite fit if the story were entirely fabricated. For instance, Cornelius Thorne's wife had died giving birth to Elise. He never remarried, devoted himself entirely to his craft and his daughter. After Elise's disappearance, he became reclusive, took no new commissions, spoke to virtually no one. He was found dead in his home exactly 20 years to the day after the clock tower was completed. heart failure, the death certificate said. But he was found seated in a chair facing the tower, his gaze presumably fixed on the clock face he could see through his window. Was he watching over her, visiting her in the only way he could, or simply mourning her loss while looking at the monument he'd built to her memory? The story doesn't say. The evidence doesn't tell us. I examined the tower itself as carefully as I could, without access to the mechanism. The architecture is sound but unusual. The proportions don't quite match other towers of the same period. There are spaces in the structure that seem to serve no purpose. Gaps in the stonework that aren't corridors or rooms. Just empty spaces. As if the tower were built around something that needed room to move, to breathe, to exist. Or perhaps they're just odd architectural choices. Perhaps the builder had reasons that have been lost to time. One night, very late, I stood beneath the tower and listened. The city was quiet as it ever gets. And in that stillness, I thought I heard something. Not the tick of the clock mechanism. That's too well insulated to hear from ground level. Something else. A rhythm. A pulse. Very faint. Very subtle. Like breathing heard through a closed door. Or perhaps it was just the wind in the tower's crevices. Perhaps it was my imagination, primed by the story I'd been investigating, hearing what it expected to hear. I don't know. And that's the point. I don't know. I wrote my report to no one in particular, filing it away in my own records. My conclusions were necessarily vague. The clock tower keeps perfect time through mechanisms unknown. Elise Thorne disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Cornelius Thorne devoted the last 20 years of his life to something that took all his skill and left him emotionally devastated. The story that connects these facts is unverifiable but internally consistent. Whether Elise Thorne lives in the clock is a question I cannot answer. Whether her life has been preserved through clockwork is beyond my capacity to investigate. Whether love can be transformed into mechanism. Whether a father's devotion can defeat death through perfect engineering. These are not detective questions. They're questions of faith, of belief, of the willingness to accept that some things might be true, even without proof. What I can say is this: the clock keeps perfect time. It has done so for 117 years. It will presumably continue to do so. And somewhere in the city, that precision matters to someone, perhaps to no one living. perhaps to a memory, perhaps to a girl who became clockwork and now measures eternity in perfectly calibrated seconds. Or perhaps it's just a very well-built clock, and the story is just a story, and I've spent weeks investigating nothing more than the human need to find meaning in precision. I genuinely don't know which answer I prefer. Sometimes I still walk past the tower. I look up at the clock face, watch the hands sweep their perfect arcs, and I think about Elise Thorne, who may or may not be inside, who may or may not be experiencing time in a way entirely different from the rest of us. Each second perfect, each moment preserved, never rushed, never lost, just existing in the eternal present of perfect mechanical time. It's a comforting thought. The idea that somewhere, somehow, someone has found a way to make time stop running out, to preserve what matters through precision and care and impossible engineering. Even if it's not true, it's a beautiful idea. And beauty, I've found, is its own kind of truth. The clock keeps perfect time. That much is certain. Everything else is mystery. And some mysteries, I think, should remain unsolved, should be allowed to exist in the space between possible and impossible, between hope and evidence, between the things we know and the things we need to believe. Elise Thorne, wherever you are, whenever you are, I hope your father's clock keeps running. I hope time, for you, is gentle and measured and endless. I hope every second is perfect. And I hope that someday, when my own time runs out, someone cares enough to wonder about me the way I've wondered about you, to investigate my story the way I've investigated yours, to let my mystery remain unsolved, if that's what it wants to be. The clock keeps perfect time. That's enough. That's all we need to know. The cases are told, the mysteries examined, some solved, some understood, one left deliberately open like a question mark written in fog. Outside, the rain continues its patient work, washing the streets clean, filling the gutters with small rivers that flow toward the sea. The fog has thickened, wrapping the city in cotton wool, softening every edge and muting every sound. It's very late now, or very early. The distinction hardly matters in a place like this, where time moves differently, where the clocks keep perfect time, but the hours refuse to be counted. The fire in my grate has burned down to nothing more than memory and warmth. The tea has gone cold. The papers on my desk have been arranged and rearranged until they tell stories I'm too tired to read. You're welcome to stay, of course. The chair is comfortable. The rain is peaceful. And there's something deeply right about being warm and dry while the city outside surrenders itself to water and mist. I'll be here, writing perhaps, or just thinking, or maybe not even that. Just existing in the soft space between awake and sleeping, where the best thoughts sometimes occur without being thought at all. The lighthouse keeper who found peace in duty, the ferryman who waits in mythology and metaphor, the clockmaker's daughter who may or may not tick away the seconds in a tower that keeps perfect time. Their stories are with me now, and with you, part of the endless collection of mysteries that make up a life spent investigating the strange, the sad, the beautiful, the true. The fog will lift eventually. It always does. But for now, let it remain. Let the city stay wrapped in mystery. Let the rain continue its work. Let the hours pass without counting them. Close your eyes if you'd like. The mysteries will wait. They're patient, like fog, like rain, like time itself when you stop fighting it and let it carry you where it wants to go. I'll still be here when you wake. The fire will have been rebuilt. The tea will be hot again. And there will be new cases to consider, new stories to tell, new mysteries to examine with gentle curiosity and patient attention. But for now, rest. Let the sound of rain be your companion. Let the fog be your blanket. Let the distant rhythm of a lighthouse, beam sweeping across dark water, or perhaps the perfect tick of a clock tower that never errs, be the heartbeat that reminds you that you're safe, you're home, you're exactly where you need to be. The city is sleeping. The mysteries are sleeping. The fog and rain keep their eternal watch, requiring nothing from you, expecting nothing, just existing in peaceful companionship with the night. Sleep well, traveler. The fog-bound mysteries will be here when you wake, and so will I, with more stories, more cases, more journeys through the comfortable darkness, where questions matter more than answers. and wonder is worth more than certainty. Until then, let the rain fall, let the fog drift, let the night hold you gently in its patient, timeless hands. Everything else can wait. If you enjoyed these fog-bound mysteries, if the rain and the cases and the gentle unraveling of truth helped you find peace tonight, I hope you'll consider leaving a like and subscribing for more bedtime stories from the city where fog never lifts. There are always more mysteries waiting in the mist, always more tales to tell, while the rain taps its rhythm against old windows and the gaslight flickers warm and golden in the eternal twilight. Until next time, sleep well. The mysteries will keep